Princess Diana ever discuss him?
Yes, very fondly, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
When you look back, was there one particular time when you and Princess Diana just had a ball together?
There are friendships that the world watches from the outside, and then there are friendships that quietly hold people together from within, the kind that never make the front page until something shatters them. The bond between Sir Elton John and Princess Diana was both. It was loud enough to fill concert halls and quiet enough to survive in handwritten letters, late-night phone calls, and shared laughter over things that nobody else was supposed to hear. But for decades, the full picture of what these two people truly meant to each other has been filtered through palace press offices, tabloid headlines, and carefully managed public appearances. Now, through Elton John's own words, from his autobiography, his interviews, and his public statements, the actual truth is finally coming into focus. And it is far more human, far more complicated, and far more moving than anything the official story ever gave us. To understand why Elton John and Princess Diana found each other so naturally, you have to understand what they each were before they found each other. Elton John was already one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet by the time the 1980s arrived. He had sold out stadiums, worn feathered costumes the size of small buildings, and put out album after album that defined a generation. But beneath the glitter and the platform boots, he was a man who carried enormous private pain, struggles with addiction, questions about identity, and a deep loneliness that fame had only made louder. Diana Spencer, on the other hand, was a 20-year-old kindergarten teacher who had been chosen, in the way that royals choose things, to become the future Queen of England. She had barely had time to figure out who she was before the entire world decided who she should be. The palace gave her a role. The press gave her a persona. And almost nobody gave her permission to simply be a person. These two crossed paths for the first time in 1981 at Windsor Castle, during the 21st birthday celebration for Prince Andrew. Elton was there as a performer, hired to provide music for an evening of aristocratic celebration. The guest list was filled with the kind of names that make ordinary people nervous just to read. Elton later recalled arriving to find that when he got there was virtually no one on the dance floor, just Diana Spencer, not yet a princess, standing near the edge of the celebration. What happened next tells you everything about who she was. According to Elton, the two of them ended up dancing the Charleston together on that empty ballroom floor, laughing and making ridiculous faces while the great and serious of England watched on. Even the late Queen reportedly smiled at the sight. One of the most consistent things Elton John has said about Diana over the years is that the woman the public saw and the woman he knew were two entirely different people. Not because she was dishonest, but because the role she had been handed demanded a kind of performance that left almost no room for the real her. To the cameras and to the crowds, she was shy, soft-spoken, and deferential. She looked up through her fringe at photographers with those famous eyes, and the world fell completely in love with the image. But behind closed doors, the real Diana was sharp, irreverent, and had the instincts of a natural comedian. Elton described her to author Craig Brown as a real gossip and incredibly indiscreet, and he meant both of those things as the highest possible compliments. She knew every story worth knowing about every room she walked into, and she was not remotely shy about sharing them with someone she trusted. She had a wicked, dry sense of humor that she kept carefully hidden from anyone she did not feel safe around. With Elton, she felt safe. The two of them would spend hours together laughing about royal life, its absurdities, its unwritten rules, its bizarre social protocols. Diana would tease Elton about his spectacles and his increasingly theatrical stage costumes. He would retaliate with stories from the road that had no business being told in polite company. They behaved, by Elton's own description, like two schoolchildren who were absolutely not supposed to be talking in class. This was what made the friendship so valuable to both of them. They were each other's pressure valve. In a world where everything they did was watched, judged, and commented upon, they had found someone with whom they could simply exhale. Elton John hosted legendary dinner parties, and Princess Diana was occasionally among his guests, which created situations that even he could not have scripted. Perhaps the most remarkable of these evenings involved two of the most famous action stars in the world, Richard Gere and Sylvester Stallone. Both men arrived at the same dinner, and both men, it quickly became apparent, were entirely unprepared for what it felt like to be in a room with Princess Diana. Elton wrote about this evening in detail in his autobiography, and the story is genuinely extraordinary. Almost immediately upon meeting, Richard Gere and Diana gravitated toward each other with an ease that made the rest of the room feel invisible. They ended up sitting on the floor in front of the fireplace and fell into the kind of deep, effortless conversation that makes everyone watching slightly envious. They laughed, leaned in, and were, by Elton's account, utterly absorbed in each other. Sylvester Stallone, meanwhile, had arrived at that dinner with very specific hopes about the evening, and watching those hopes dissolve in real time put him in a mood that, according to Elton, made the atmosphere of the house feel extremely tense. When dinner was eventually called, Gere and Stallone were missing. Elton's partner went to locate them and came back with alarming news. The two actors had squared off in the hallway, on the verge of a genuine physical altercation, apparently over which of them was going to spend more time with the Princess of Wales. It took a carefully worded intervention to get them back to the table. Stallone remained visibly furious throughout dinner, and eventually, he left the party early. Elton recalled that as Stallone departed, he made it absolutely clear that he would not have accepted the invitation had he known the situation he was walking into. What Elton found most extraordinary about the whole episode was not the behavior of two of Hollywood's biggest stars, although that was extraordinary enough, but the behavior of Diana herself. She remained, throughout all of it, perfectly composed. She appeared either completely unaware of the rivalry boiling around her, or simply unbothered by it in a way that only made her more magnetic. Elton came to call this the Diana effect, the almost gravitational pull she had on people, particularly men who considered themselves powerful and self-possessed. She did not try to do it. She simply walked into rooms and rewrote the rules of them. In the mid-1980s, while the rest of the world was still struggling to understand the AIDS epidemic, Princess Diana did something that Elton John has called one of the most courageous acts he ever witnessed. The fear surrounding HIV and AIDS at that time was profound and, in many cases, brutal. People with the disease were being abandoned by employers, by communities, and in some heartbreaking cases, by their own families. The misinformation was so widespread that millions of people genuinely believed you could contract the virus through casual contact, a handshake, a shared glass, a brief touch. In April 1987, Diana attended the opening of the first specialized HIV and AIDS unit at the Middlesex Hospital in London. When she walked through the ward, she did something that the cameras captured and the world never forgot. She reached out and shook the hand of a patient. No gloves, no hesitation, no performance of caution. For most people watching at home, it was an astonishing image. For the patients in that ward, who had grown used to being treated as if their very presence was dangerous, it was something close to a miracle. Elton was watching his own community being decimated during those years. Friends from the music world, the fashion world, the art world, men he had known and loved, were dying, and they were dying in conditions of stigma and isolation that made their suffering even more terrible. He has spoken openly about the grief and fury of that period, and about how much Diana's decision to simply, publicly, and without any apparent concern for her own image, treat those patients as human beings worthy of dignity, meant to him and to so many others. By the mid-1990s, the world around both Elton and Diana was growing more turbulent. Diana's marriage to Prince Charles was publicly collapsing in the most painful way imaginable, playing out in leaked interviews, competing biographies, and the slow, grinding machinery of royal separation. She was losing her formal royal title and the security that came with it. Elton, meanwhile, was deeply invested in a project that he hoped would raise significant funds for his AIDS Foundation, a lavish photography book called Rock and Royalty, assembled with his close friend Gianni Versace. Diana had agreed to write the foreword for the book. It seemed like a natural extension of the work they had always done together, her voice lending weight to a cause they both believed in. But as the book moved toward completion, something changed. The images inside included semi-nude male models alongside photographs of the royal family, and when the palace caught wind of the contents, pressure was applied. Diana abruptly withdrew her support and her foreword, claiming, according to Elton's account in Me, that she had not been aware of the book's contents. This was the part that truly wounded him. Versace had shown Diana the entire book beforehand. She had, by Elton's account, said she loved it. The last-minute reversal, combined with what felt to him like a dishonest explanation, was a betrayal that hit somewhere deep. He wrote back to her directly, not pulling his punches, telling her exactly how much money her withdrawal had cost his AIDS Foundation, and making clear that he knew she had seen the book in its entirety. He was angry, but he was also, underneath the anger, genuinely worried. He later wrote that he had begun to sense that Diana was pulling away from many of the people who had known her longest and most honestly, and surrounding herself instead with those who told her only what she wanted to hear. He recognized that pattern from his own darkest years. He knew what it led to. Diana's response was, by his description, a letter so cold and formal that it might have been written by a stranger. The warmth was gone. The friendship went quiet. For months in which both of them were navigating some of the most difficult periods of their lives, they did not speak. What finally broke the silence was not a decision that either of them made. It was grief. On July 15, 1997, Gianni Versace was shot and killed outside his home in Miami. It was a murder that sent shockwaves through every circle both Elton and Diana occupied. Versace had been a close friend to both of them, the very person, in fact, whose book had caused their falling out. His death was the thing that made the months of silence suddenly seem very small. Diana called Elton at his home in Nice the same day the news broke. She was on a boat in the Mediterranean at the time, and she picked up the phone anyway. According to Elton's memoir, the conversation was uncomplicated. She told him she was sorry. She said the whole thing had been a silly falling out. And just like that, no lengthy negotiations, no formal reconciliation process. It was over. They were friends again. They both traveled to Milan for Versace's funeral on July 22nd, and they sat together in the cathedral through a service that was, by any account, overwhelming. Elton was distraught, openly and completely grief-stricken in a way that he rarely allowed himself to be in public. Diana sat beside him, and at one point, she leaned toward him. Photographers in the cathedral captured the moment, and for years, it circulated as an image of a princess tenderly consoling her grieving friend. Elton eventually revealed what she had actually whispered to him in that solemn moment. She had leaned over to ask if he had a mint because she was desperate for a polo. Even at a funeral, even after months of silence and sorrow, she was still exactly herself. The woman who could find the tiny sliver of absurdity in a heavy moment and use it to remind you that you were still alive. They made plans after Milan. They talked about having lunch when they were both back in London. Diana even wrote to Elton afterward, offering to become a patron of his AIDS Foundation and asking him to support her campaign against landmines, two causes that fit together as naturally as the two of them always had. It felt like a new beginning. It felt like they had survived the worst of it and come out the other side. In the days following Diana's death, as the world collapsed into a grief that no one had quite anticipated or prepared for, Richard Branson called Elton John with an observation. People gathering outside the palaces to leave flowers and write in the books of condolence were quoting, over and over again, the lyrics of Candle in the Wind, Elton's 1973 song originally written about Marilyn Monroe. Branson asked whether Elton would consider performing a rewritten version at the funeral. Elton called his longtime songwriting partner Bernie Taupin, who went to work immediately. Taupin later described how the opening lines came naturally and quickly. Goodbye England's rose / may you ever grow in our hearts. The rest followed from there. The new version was written to honor a woman who had lived a version of the same life the song had always been about. The bright light that gets extinguished before anyone has had enough time in its warmth. What almost nobody knew at the time, and what documents released by the UK National Archives only confirmed years later, was that the royal family had initially resisted the idea of Elton performing the song at all. Buckingham Palace reportedly found the new lyrics too sentimental. The Dean of Westminster Abbey, Dr. Wesley Carr, had to argue personally for the song's inclusion, writing that boldness was needed at that particular moment in the service and that something classical or choral would be entirely inappropriate. He went so far as to arrange for a backup saxophonist to be on standby in case the palace held firm. They did not hold firm. Elton performed. He has described what it felt like to sit down at that piano in Westminster Abbey on September 6, 1997. He was terrified. He used a teleprompter so that he would not accidentally revert to the original lyrics. He felt the weight of billions of eyes in a way that no stadium performance had ever produced, because this was not a performance. It was a goodbye. He later wrote that it was simultaneously the biggest moment of his professional life and the moment that felt the least like it had anything to do with him at all. He kept his focus on the piano. He kept his voice steady. He finished the song. The single was released 6 days after the funeral. It sold over 650,000 copies on its first day in the UK alone. Worldwide, it sold more than 33 million copies, every penny of the royalties going to Diana's Memorial Charitable Fund. It became the best-selling single in the history of the UK charts and one of the best-selling singles ever recorded anywhere in the world. Elton John has said that watching William and Harry walk behind their mother's coffin through the streets of London was one of the most painful things he has ever witnessed. They were 15 and 12 years old. The cameras of the world were on them every second. He thought, watching them, that it was absolutely inhumane. That grief at that age, in that context, without any privacy or protection, was a form of cruelty dressed as ceremony. He made a quiet vow that day to remain part of their lives in whatever way they needed. Not as a distant famous friend who sent cards and attended charity galas, but as a genuinely present person who remembered their mother as a full human being, funny and flawed and irreplaceable, and who could reflect some of that back to them as they grew.